Hi everyone. This is the last tutorial considering variables and data types in Apex. In this tutorial, we are going to talk about ID data type, string data type, object data type, and blob data type. Let's start with ID. An ID data type variable can store any valid 18 character Salesforce record ID. For example, let's consider this variable which is having the name account ID. This variable is storing the ID of account record. And if you see, it is having 18 characters. I can zoom out a little bit, and if you see, 18 characters are selected right here. I can show this to you in Salesforce org as well. So if you go to Salesforce and if I paste this ID right here, you can see that this is the ID of my account record. So this ID can be stored in a variable of type ID. Let's execute this code once and let's see if it works fine. So if you see, value of ID, account ID is equal to this particular ID. This is exactly the same. You might be aware of this thing that a record in Salesforce can have a 15-digit ID as well, and it can have a 18-digit ID as well. Here we use the 18-digit ID. Just in case I copy this particular ID, for example here, and I remove the last 3 digits. Okay, so this is going to be our 15-digit ID. So in case you assign a 15-digit ID to a variable of type ID, it is automatically going to convert that ID into 18 digits. Let's execute this code and let's see what happens. So if you see, we are getting value of ID, account ID 15 digits is equal to this particular ID. And this ID is not 15-digit ID. It is our 18-digit ID, which is this one. So Apex has automatically converted 15-digit ID into 18 digits. At last, we can test whether we can assign any other value to our ID variable or not. So we defined our account ID variable here, and here we are trying to assign a different value to this variable. And this is not an ID, it is some random value. But if you notice, this is also having 18 characters. Let's execute this whole code and let's see what happens. So if you see, value of ID account ID variable is equal to this particular ID, which is our 18-digit ID, and value of ID account ID 15 digits is equal to this, which is again the same. And now I'm getting an exception which is saying system.string exception invalid ID, this particular ID. So in case you assign a particular value to an ID variable which is not an ID, you will get an exception. Okay, let's move ahead. Now let's talk about string data type. A string data type variable can store any set of characters surrounded by single quotes. It has no limit on the number of characters. However, heap size limit is being used. What is the heap size limit? In case you are not aware of it, Apex has a heap size limit of 6 MB for synchronous processing, and it has a heap size limit of 12 MB for asynchronous processing. We don't need to get into the details of what is synchronous and what is asynchronous for now, but what we can understand is heap size is basically the size, or I can say the total size or space that all our variables are taking together in the memory in a particular transaction. For example, you have defined 2 variables here, right? And you execute this whole code. So these 2 variables are going to take some memory, right? That memory combined is 6 MB. Therefore, we don't have any particular limit for this particular variable of type string, but the total memory limit, which is 6 MB, applies here. Again, we can declare the string variable in the same manner like we did for other variables. We have the data type here, which is string, variable name, which is name, and then the value of the variable in single quotes, because this is a string. So it is SFDC stop. Let's execute this code and let's see what happens. So value of string name is equal to SFDC stop. Now what I'm doing here is, in this particular variable, I'm trying to have some white space or some extra space after the actual string. And I want to see if this is allowed or not. Okay. Let's execute this code now. So if you see, value of string name with trailing space, which is our variable name, is equal to SFDC stop. And if you notice, this is having the space at the end. So as I select this, it is giving me the space at the end. But if I show you this, here we don't have any space at the end. That means in case I'm storing a string inside a variable of type string, I can have spaces at the end as well. But what if we only have a space? Is that allowed? Let's see. So if you notice, value of string, empty string with white space is equal to, we are getting the space here as well. That means you can store an empty string with spaces as well in a string variable. I'm telling you about these things because when you store something in Salesforce, let's say you store something in a text field in Salesforce. Now, in that particular field, we cannot have these trailing white spaces, or we cannot have just a white space. That won't be stored in Salesforce. But in variables, we can have these. We can also store escape sequences in case of a string variable. Escape sequences are nothing. We have a backslash here followed by another character. For example, /n or /t. Each particular escape sequence has a meaning. /n means we want to have a new line, and /t means we want to have a tab. Let's execute this code and it will be more clear to you. Now, if you see, value of string escape sequence is equal to, now it is starting from a new line, right? Because we have /n at the beginning itself. And between SFDC and stop, we have a tab. So if you notice, these are not multiple spaces. This is a tab. It is coming by /t. In some cases, we also have a slash within the string. For example, if I say SFDC stop / blog about Salesforce, right? What will happen if I execute this code? Let's see. So if you see, I'm getting an error where it is saying illegal string literal, and it is saying illegal character sequence / in string literal. This means that we cannot have a backslash within a string. But what if you want to have a backslash? What will you do? You can have this backslash followed by another backslash. Let's execute this code and let's see. So now if you see, I'm getting it. SFDC stop a blog about Salesforce. This time, this slash is coming perfectly fine. Basically, what is happening here is the first backslash is escaping the other backslash, which is why this is working fine. So just in case you want to have a backslash within your string, you can have it by following it with another backslash. Now let's see whether we can apply some operators within our string or not. For example, we have a string A, which is storing apple. We have a string B, which is storing mango. What will happen if I do A less than B? Think about it, pause the video, and let's come back. Now, if we execute this code, here you can see I'm getting true here. So it is showing me that apple is less than mango. And why is it true? Because A is less than M, right? So if you think alphabetically, A will come before M, which is why this is coming as true. Now let's see what will happen if I do this. We have a string C storing SFDC. We have a string D storing stop. And now I want to do C is equal to D. Let's execute this code. And if you see here, it is coming as false. In computer science, a single equal to is used for assignment because we are assigning a value here, and double equal to is used for comparison. So we are comparing here whether SFDC is equal to stop or not, which is why this is coming as false. Now what will happen if I do this? C less than D. Let's execute this code. And now I'm getting true here. Why I'm getting true? You can say, right, that S is equal to S. So why I'm getting true here? This is because F is less than T. So if you think alphabetically, F will come before T, right? So this means that in case we have the first character which is equal, we'll take up the second character for comparison and so on. In case I do, let's say this, so I'm getting C equal to D, and let's say if I do SFDC is equal to SFDC. Now let's see what will happen. This time I'm getting it as true because these two strings are equal. So just in case you want to compare two strings, whether those are equal or not, you can use equal to. You might think, what will happen if I do something like this? Let's execute this as well. So if you see, this time also, I'm getting it as true. This means that this comparison is not case sensitive. It doesn't matter if the characters are in uppercase or lowercase, it will return us true. Now let's move to object data type. An object data type variable can store value of any data type that is supported in Apex. All data types inherit from the object. Okay, as simple as that. This means that it can store an integer as well, it can store a string as well, it can store a boolean as well. This is because all the data types in Apex are coming or inherited from the object data type. So it can store any value. Let's try assigning an integer, and if you see, value of object num is equal to 10. This is working fine. Now let's try assigning a string, and if you see, value of object name is equal to sfdc stop. This is also working fine. Now you can ask, that Rahul, if we can store any value inside an object, then why are we having all these different data types? For example, string, integer, and all the other data types that we studied till now. This is because having a variable of object data type doesn't give us any idea about what value it is storing. For example, let's say you are having this variable somewhere in your code after 100 lines. Then you don't know what kind of value it can have. It can have a string as well, it can have an integer as well, it can have any other value as well. To understand this properly, let's execute this code. What we are having here, we are having a number 1, which is an object storing a value 10, number 2, again an object storing a value 20, and here we are saying sum of object num1 and num2 is equal to, now I'm doing num1 plus num2. Ideally, these two are integers, right? This is also an integer, this is also an integer. So we should have the sum here. But what we are getting an error which is saying arithmetic expressions must use numeric arguments. This means that compiler cannot identify whether these two are numeric arguments or not, because we haven't defined that this is a numeric argument. It is an object, right? It can have a number, it cannot have a number as well. This is why primitive data types are important, because some of the operations can only be performed on variables which are having a type as primitive data type. We do have an option. We can convert a variable which is of type object into a variable which is of type integer, or we can say into a variable of type string or boolean or any other primitive data type. Here what I'm doing, I have two variables num1 and num2. Both are of type object. I'm assigning num1 to a variable of type integer by converting it into an integer. So this bracket integer is basically telling us that I want to convert the value of num1 into an integer, and I want to assign it to this particular integer variable. Similarly, I am doing it for num2. And finally, I am showing the sum of num1 int and num2 int, which are nothing but integer variables. Let's execute this whole code and let's see what happens. Now if you see, I am getting sum of integer num1 int and num2 int is equal to 30. This time I'm getting the sum because I'm using integer variables. Now let's move on to blob data type. So this is the last one, and this is very simple. A blob data type variable can store a collection of binary data, okay, as a single object. Blob basically stands for binary large object because it is storing binary data. Example of blob data type can be, let's consider the contents of an image. So let's say you are performing some integration and you are getting the contents of an image from an external server into your Apex code. So in that case, those contents will be stored as blob. Blob can also be converted to a string, and string can also be converted to a blob. This is possible. Now blob is not something which we can assign to this particular variable of type blob directly. Why? Because that is binary data. So what we can do, we can have a string and we can convert that string into a blob by using blob.value of, and then we can assign it to a blob variable. Let's execute this once and let's see what happens. So if you see, I'm getting value of blob b1, which is our variable name, is equal to blob4. What is blob4 is telling us? It is telling us that we are storing a blob of 4 characters in this particular variable. We can also convert a blob back to a string by using the toString method after this variable, which we have defined. So we can do b1, which is our variable name, dot toString, and then we can convert this variable, or I can say blob, back to a string. In case you're not getting it properly, that's fine, because we haven't studied about methods and classes for now. We'll study all of them in the future tutorials, and then these methods will be more clear. For example, toString and value of, etc. Let's execute this whole code and let's see what happens. So first of all, I'm getting value of blob b1 is equal to blob4, which is fine. And then I'm converting this b1 blob back to a string by using this toString method. So what I'm getting value of blob b1 as string, which is this, is equal to test. So I have converted b1 back to a string and I'm getting the value, which is nothing but test. That's all for this tutorial. We covered all the variables and data types till now, starting from Boolean up till blob. In the next tutorial, we'll start with a new topic. See you next time.